Good evening all. I welcome you all to our lecture on environment and humans, course code 2161. So I'll be taking us on integration of ecology and environment into development planning and ecological development. Integration of ecology and environment into development planning. So before we start, we'll be looking at some terminology, because when we are talking about integration of ecology, first we need to know what ecology is, then environment, and how these two can be considered while doing development planning. So environment can be defined as the sum total of all conditions and influences that affect the development and life of all organisms. So all the conditions that surrounds one in the ecosystem is defined as environment. Of course, wherever you find yourself is your environment. That small confinement or even a larger confinement where you find yourself is your own environment. So talking about ecology, of course, when we see the word logy, we know that it has to do with study. So ecology is a branch of science that deals with the study of interaction between biotic and abiotic organisms or environment. Okay, so a branch of science that deals with the study of interaction between living organisms and their physical environment is defined as ecology. So then what is ecosystem? Ecosystem is simply put as the functional unit in the ecology. So in other words, both the environment and the ecosystem are inside ecology. We can put it in that way. So then let's look at what development planning is. And I said that development planning can be defined as a systematic or careful formulated course of action, policies designed to achieve the developmental goals of a society. So we have to note the keywords: systematic or careful formulated course. So when we're talking about development planning, you don't just, for instance, if you want to build a house, you don't just get a land and start building. There are some things you have to consider before you even start. One is getting a land, of course, where the building that you want to live in will be. Then second is to get an architect, of course, who will draw the design of the your dream house. Then the person will make cost of what this type of house is going to cost you. You know, the materials, how many pillars is going to have. If not, you see yourself building and getting stuck in the middle, you know, and some buildings that will equally collapse. So development planning help us to avoid all these unnecessary calamities that might occur while we are trying to make a better plan in the ecosystem. So we talk about integration of ecology and environment into development planning. Of course, now we know what ecology is and we know what environment is. Remember, I said that ecology is the study of interaction between living and non-living things of the environment, of the ecosystem. Okay, and this, when we talk about integrating ecology and environment in the development planning, it has to do with sustainable development. Of course, it's only when we sustain our development that we can even talk about growing or making the ecosystem a better place for us to live in. So sustainable development requires that society only use nature's resources at the rate at which they can be replenished naturally. It can also be defined as the meeting of the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their needs. You know, unlike what we found in our country, where we want to exploit all our natural resources so that the future generation will not even be able to witness it. Don't be surprised in years to come, Nigeria will run out of oil and we'll be telling our future generation that we are once an oil producing country. And this is because we do not think about sustainable development in this country. And that's why when you go to developed country, you find out that they keep to that sustainable development goals. I don't know if any of you join the Sustainable Development Goal Club. It's a very wonderful club. Of course, there you learn to see how the ecosystem should be managed in order for us, the human, and all the living things to benefit from there. Of course, when we do not take care of the ecosystem in which we find ourselves, it will, in one way or the other, backfire to us and will be the one that will be reaping the effect of whatever impact we make on the ecosystem. So sustainable use and management of ecosystem is also a key to poverty alleviation in the country or nation. Yes, because the main people who derive from the benefits of this ecosystem are mostly the poor. Yeah, because they are the people that are in direct contact with the environment where this development will occur, especially in the rural areas. Okay, so why ecosystem services tend to be particularly important to the livelihood of the poor, their degradation and loss can have devastating impacts on the well-being of the poor, just like I explained. For instance, those that are doing rehouse business, of course they have to clear that big forest, and of course the poor living around that area are depending on this forest for their firewood, depending on the trees there for their food. And when these things are done without considering the people around them, you find out that it helps send some people back again to beginning. Okay, so when we are doing things in the ecosystem, of course we have to consider the pros and the cons, the benefits, and weigh it with the risk associated with doing a certain kind of thing we want to put in place. So again, we will look at why biodiversity and ecosystem services are important for development and poverty alleviation. So, and I said that the impact of biodiversity and ecosystem degradation is most severe among people living in poverty, since they have a few livelihood options. Therefore, the access to and sustainable use of the biodiversity and the ecosystem services by the poor is of direct relevance to the effort at poverty alleviation efforts. So what this is trying to say is that the poor are actually the people who are directly in contact, or the impact of this development planning gets to. Just like I said in my example, people doing real estate planning, clearing a big forest. Of course, before you even do that, you have to look at the geography of that area. Removing these trees, will it actually lead to this environment having erosion? Okay, the source of food that these people are driving from this forest, how are we going to do about it? The source of timber and other thing, their livelihood, farming, where they get money, and so on. So these things have to be considered. If not, we'll end up having more poorer people, or making people more wretched in our midst. So I say one of the reasons why biodiversity and ecosystem services are important for development and poverty alleviation is that, one, 70% of the world poor live in rural areas and depend directly on biological diversity for their livelihood. Just like I explained before, the poor people are actually the people that are in direct contact and direct dependent on the biological diversity for their livelihood. Then the second is that more than 3 billion people depend on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihood. We now talk about the fishermen who actually does this job as a living. Okay, that's their source of income. And so I'm trying to build development in that area without also considering them, and how to maybe provide another source of income to them who you in that community. For instance, if it's a community that is known for farming or for fishing, it will make them to go back and become more wretched and poor because they do not have another means of livelihood. They will talk about forest being home to 80% of the remaining terrestrial biodiversity. Of course, whenever we'll try to clear the bushes and the forest around us in order to develop that area, will send some species into extinction. And these are what we should consider whenever we want to develop a place I have to first consider the endangered species in that area and find a way to conserve them. We can first send the animal, the people that are in charge of keeping animals, they can come there and then evacuate this animal in order to keep them safe. So there are steps that should be taken whenever we want to talk about development planning. But before then, let's look at components of sustainable development. So in order to achieve a sustainable development, there are factors that need to be put in place, and one of them is population stabilization. And I found out that in our country we have a problem of not being able to control our population, especially in the north, where you see older people marrying underage females in order to, I don't know how, maybe to keep giving birth. So you can see a man having 3 wives and then maybe 13 to 15 children, and all this cannot help our ecosystem, or will I say our environment. It came a time in China where they devised a means in order to control their population. A law was given that each family should not have more than a child. And after some time, when they felt that their population had been controlled to some certain level, they also increased the number of children that a family can have to 2. And all this helped to keep the environment in check. Because there's this course I'm teaching in Bio 361 where we'll talk about the carrying capacity of the environment. I found out that when the environment or the ecosystem exceed this carrying capacity, the environment has a way of fighting back in order to regulate the number of people found in that particular environment. Take for instance the earthquake that happened in Turkey. This is just a way of the environment using its hand to reduce the number of population in that particular region. And then we can talk about hunger, we can talk about famine, disease, rapid spread of disease, and people dying. So this is just a way of the environment trying to control the number of population that is found there. And so when we do not checkmate our population size, all these have effect on the sustainable development. Because when we talk about sustainable development, we have to align it with the goal of the SDGs. So, and that's zero hunger, So you cannot have excess population and you expect not to have hunger everywhere. And that's why, of course, I'm using Nigeria as a point of my lecture, because we are lagging behind in different areas, because one, our population is not being considered, we do not checkmate it, and there is hunger everywhere. They have the integrated land use planning. Of course, when we talk about integrated land use planning, we're also talking about sustainability of that land. Being able to use the natural resources that we found in a way that it can be replenished naturally, without exploiting them. Now we talk about conservation of biodiversity, then air and water pollution control. How do we control all this in order not to degrade or lead to biodiversity loss? Talk about renewable energy resources like wind and solar energy. How do we employ these in order to make use of them without causing harm to the environment? Then recycling of waste and residues, environmental education and awareness at all levels. Of course, this sustainable development should be taught in all levels of studies, including those who are in the rural regions or in the village that do not have access to education. We are all meant to know about the importance of making the ecosystem or the environment where we find ourselves conducive or comfortable for our own good. Then there are steps to integrating ecology and environment into development planning. And just like I told us in the beginning of the lecture, you don't just start get a land and start building your house. You have to first get a plan of the design of the house you want to build. How much is it going to cost, the material you need, how many pillars will the building require in order not to collapse. So also in development planning, there are steps that you need to take in order to integrate this ecology and environment into it, in order to consider the environment and make sure that we are not trying to make the biodiversity to become to have a negative impact on us that are living in the environment. So there are 6 steps to integrating ecology and environment into development planning. The first is defining the scope. You first have to establish your objective. What do you intend to do? What is your design? How do you intend to achieve this your plan? Okay, then who are the main stakeholders to be involved? That's defining the scope. You have to find what exactly do you want to do, so you do not go about beating around the bush. Then the second step is screening and prioritizing. Here, of course, you have to prioritize the ecosystem service, which are most relevant to the services considered to be sources of risk or opportunity to your beneficiaries or targeted group. So you have to find out one, just like the economists say, as a scale of preference, what are more important. Do I need to add or remove this particular thing in order to ensure that the environment is not being endangered? So I say try to focus on 3 to 6 ecosystem services considered to be sources of risk or opportunity. So when we talk about opportunity, we are talking about benefit to your development plan in order to reduce concrete results. So the third step is to identify condition, the trends, and the trend of. Of course, when you are doing something, you consider the trend. When we talk about trend, what is in vogue at that moment that you are doing it. Okay, you don't want to go and build house now. You start building a thatch house. Of course, it's no longer in vogue. And then you have to consider the trade-off. When we talk about trade-off, I said that these are balance or compromise achieved between two competing, conflicting, or incompatible features. So it actually arises from management choices or action that intentionally or otherwise alter the quantity or quality of an ecosystem services in order to achieve a certain goal. So for instance, again, using Nigeria as a study, in our Naira design, we find out that they do not, or will I say, maybe they did actually follow these steps, but then the result at the end of the day might have showed them that this is not the right time to do Naira design, but because of their selfish desire or maybe a selfish motive of an individual, they went ahead to do the Naira redesign, and then at the end of the day, the effect is felt by us, the citizen. We do not have enough money in circulation. Then lots of things were happening to the Naira. Even the colors are not superior and all that. So these are things that we see when we do not consider these steps in implementing our development planning. Then another example is the extraction of timber for economic reasons. So when we exploit all these natural resources in a way that they cannot replenish itself, then over time we'll start having problems like erosion and so many of them. So even the carbon sequestration, of course, is the plants that help us to recycle carbon, and even the what's it called, the ozone layer. That's the green green gas. So is the plant that actually help us to purify the environment, and when we cut them indiscriminately, we have the effects coming back to haunt us. So the fourth step is appraising the institution and cultural framework. This step will give you an overview of the institutional and cultural framework. So it will include analysis of the policies, regulation, and informal rules that directly or indirectly affect your key ecosystem services, as well as the key institution and traditional authorities that influence the ecosystem management. So the fifth is preparing better decision making. So first, you summarize the main risk and the benefits for your development plan using the information you gathered before. You have to summarize them. You weigh the benefits, you also weigh the risk. If I cut down the trees, or if I remove this forest in this area, what are actually the benefits, and then what are the future risks? Will it endanger this particular area to be waterlogged, will it make it to have erosion and people will not be able to go through this area in the next 5 or 10 years. So these are the things we put in consideration whenever we are talking about development planning. We have to consider the ecosystem, we have to consider the environment in which these things will be done or will be carried out. So we have to build on the information generated. Okay, we'll talk about the step 5 is preparing better decision making. So like I say, summarize the main risk and opportunity for your development plan using information gathered before. We also build on this information generated using the previous steps to identify the entry points to key decision making. So you have to follow these steps and look at the information you have already generated and then be able to take it to step 6, which is implementing the change. Of course, after gathering all this information and you do not implement it, is a waste of time. Just like after reading and preparing for your exam and finally you do not write the exam, or maybe after writing the exam and finally you do not graduate from the university. It's actually a waste of time because there's no evidence that you actually went to the university. So is that your certificate that shows okay, you went to the university? So without implementation, our efforts is being wasted already. So this step will help you to define your implementation strategy and concentrate working plan, including policy, instruments, stakeholders involved in that development plan, and then responsibility and action, as well as the financial resources. Of course, when you talk about development planning, it's going to cost you, so you have to also check how much is going to cost you, how much is going to take in order to be able to carry out this plan that I have. Then talk about integrating the ecosystem service guide. So this provides guidance to the development planners on how to, one, understand people's dependency and impact on ecosystem services. The second is to identify ecosystem services and related ecosystems that are crucial for the success of the development process. Then the third is to assess the condition and trends of ecosystem services and the resulting risk and opportunity for the development plan. Then develop strategy measures to manage the identified risk and opportunity. And finally is to develop a working plan to implement the selected strategies and measures. So this is the integrating ecosystem service guide, which will help anyone that wants to go into development planning to consider the ecosystem and the environment in which they are going to establish that development. So again, we will talk about the entry points for integrating the ecosystem. One is providing information. Of course, from the information we've gathered, we will know when to start this development. Is it in the rainy season? Is it in the dry season? The certain incentive, both physical and market based. Then we'll talk about planning and regulation use. Then we'll talk about drivers of biodiversity. And I said that a driver of biodiversity can be defined as any natural or human-induced factor that directly or indirectly causes biodiversity loss. So any factor, be it human or natural, that lead to a loss of biodiversity is just a driver, and it can be divided into two. We have the direct driver and the indirect driver. So some of the most important direct drivers of the ecosystem are habitat loss and degradation. You have excessive nutrient load and other forms of pollution. Then overexploitation and unsustainable use, just like we do in Nigeria, where we overexploit our natural resources so that the future generation will not be able to enjoy the resources as we are doing. They have the invasive alien species and climate change. Of course, when we keep on doing real estate, modernizing everywhere, we'll have climatical problem because there will not be enough trees or greeneries to ensure that the environment is being kept safe, because this plant actually does a lot of work for us. Then we'll talk about indirect drivers. These are actually the human-induced factor. Example include the changes in population, not being able to control our population. is one of the indirect drivers, and this also directly affects the direct drivers that affect the biodiversity. So we have the economic activity and technology, as well as socio-political and cultural factors. Okay, so this is the end of the class for this part, which is the integration of ecology and environment into development planning. So in our next lecture, we'll be talking about ecology management. So how can we actually manage our ecosystem in order to benefit fully from it? So thank you for listening. I'll be releasing the lecture notes to your course rep maybe after this lecture, and we will see you again in our next lecture. Thank you.